When a woman walks into a luxury car dealership dressed in jeans and a plain white tee, no one expects her to be the founder of a multi-million-dollar foundation, especially not the smug sales manager who dismisses her with a smirk and sends her toward the used car lot. But what happens the next morning, when a rare Rolls-Royce Phantom pulls up and her powerful husband steps out? Leaves the entire showroom speechless. This isn't just a story about money. It's about respect, judgment, and the kind of quiet power that doesn't need to prove itself, until the moment it must. She stepped into Boston Luxury Motors wearing faded jeans and a plain white tee, hair tied back in a low ponytail, no designer purse, no expensive jewelry, just a woman with purpose. When she asked about the sleek luxury coupe by the window, the salesman's smirk appeared faster than his greeting. He glanced her up and down like she'd walked into the wrong movie set. "I'm sorry," he said, nodding toward the exit, "but these cars start at 300 grand. A few employees chuckled behind their desks. Nearby customers turned to stare, some covering their laughter with awkward coughs. Flushed with embarrassment, she said nothing, just turned and walked out, head high but heart stung. The next morning, a Rolls-Royce Phantom glided to a smooth stop in front of the dealership. It shimmered under the early Boston sun, like it had driven straight out of a billionaire's dream. The salesman from the day before stood near the front desk, mid-conversation when the back door of the Rolls opened. He froze. The woman who stepped out wore the same white tee, the same well-worn jeans. Her makeup was light, nearly invisible, yet she moved with the self-assured calm of someone who knew exactly who she was and didn't need anyone's validation. This was Margaret Collins, Maggie to those who knew her well, founder of the Collins Foundation for Children with Disabilities, a non-profit that had quietly transformed thousands of lives across New England. Long before she married her current husband, she'd built the foundation from scratch, funding it with years of academic research, personal grit, and a relentless devotion to special needs advocacy. The world had seen her in headlines, but the man who dismissed her yesterday, he clearly hadn't been paying attention. As she walked into the dealership, the morning light catching the ends of her chestnut ponytail, she made a beeline for a deep blue Knack coupe gleaming under a spotlight. It was her sister Caroline's dream car, and after beating breast cancer just last year, Maggie wanted to give her something unforgettable for her 40th birthday. With the foundation thriving and her own investments secure, this gift wasn't about wealth, it was about love. At the other end of the gallery, Blake Thompson, the dealership's sales manager, was straightening his navy vest and smoothing out his blue tie. He considered himself a master at identifying serious buyers. When he saw Maggie walk in, wearing the same modest outfit, he chuckled to himself and nudged a colleague. This, he thought, was going to be entertaining. "Good morning," Maggie greeted politely. A young salesman, Daniel, barely 25 and swimming in a suit half a size too big, stepped forward with a warm smile. "Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors. I'm Daniel. Is there something in particular you're looking for today?" Before Maggie could answer, Blake swooped in, his voice silky but insincere. "I'll take it from here, Daniel," he said, dismissing the younger man like an eager intern. He turned to Maggie with a forced grin, his eyes still scanning her outfit. "Looking for directions, ma'am?" Maggie smiled graciously, unbothered. "Actually, I'm interested in that blue Knack coupe," she said, pointing to the high-gloss car displayed on a raised pedestal. "Price tag?" $285,000. Blake's grin widened. He'd seen it before, dreamers who came to browse, not buy. He leaned in slightly and said, "That's the Azure Limited Edition, only 15 made this year." He spoke slowly, like explaining rocket science to a toddler. "Perhaps I can show you our pre-owned inventory? It's in a separate building, just 3 blocks east." Maggie caught the flicker in his eyes as they swept over her old sneakers and unbranded clothes. She had long grown used to such assumptions. What most people didn't know was that Maggie had deliberately chosen this life, free of labels, rich in freedom. "I'd still love to learn more about the Azure," she said calmly. Blake's face twitched. He tried to remain cordial. Behind him, 2 other salesmen exchanged glances. They'd seen this dance before. The Azure is only shown by appointment, Blake lied smoothly. Our serious customers usually schedule ahead. As if on cue, a sharply dressed couple walked into the showroom. Blake's demeanor flipped in an instant. He gave Maggie a parting nod without meeting her eyes. "Why don't you grab a brochure? Daniel can help you with that." Then he strode toward the couple with outstretched arms. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, always a pleasure." Daniel, standing nearby, looked apologetic. "I'm really sorry about that," he whispered. "If you'd still like, I'd love to show you the Azure." Maggie gave him a kind nod. "Thank you, Daniel. I'd appreciate that." As Daniel began describing the car's features, adaptive suspension, hand-stitched Italian leather, twin-turbo V12. Maggie noticed Blake escorting the Harringtons directly to the Azure. He opened the door with a theatrical flourish, inviting Mrs. Harrington to sit inside. The same car he'd just claimed was by appointment only. Daniel reddened with embarrassment, but Maggie simply smiled. "It's okay," she said softly. "I understand how this works." What Blake didn't understand, however, was that the next 10 minutes would flip the balance of power and reveal the true cost of judging someone by their shoes. Blake leaned against the polished car door, explaining to the Harringtons in a syrupy voice. "This particular model has an 8-month wait list, but I've reserved a few for our special clients." Mrs. Harrington trailed her hand along the leather seat, murmuring, "It's exquisite, though I'm unsure about the color." "Not a problem," Blake replied quickly. "We can absolutely explore customizations, anything to suit your taste." Just then, Maggie took a step forward. Her tone remained composed, but her presence demanded attention. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm hoping to ask about purchasing this model." Blake's smile faltered. "As I mentioned earlier, this vehicle is currently on display for these customers," he said with a strained chuckle, gesturing to the couple as discomfort rippled through his expression. "Perhaps another time, or again. You're welcome to browse our used options." The Harringtons shifted uncomfortably, now caught in the tension between civility and spectacle, but Maggie didn't flinch. "I'm especially interested in this car," she said calmly. "My sister's birthday is next month." Blake stepped away from the couple, leaned in slightly, and lowered his voice. "Look, I get it, people like to dream, but this," he said, glancing at the luxury coupe, "this is a different world. These cars cost more than most homes." Several nearby customers began to watch. The atmosphere thickened. Daniel stood at the edge of the scene, visibly nervous. "I was planning to pay in full today," Maggie said, her voice steady as stone. That cracked something in Blake. His professional mask slipped completely. He let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, one that echoed off the marble floors. Heads turned, phones tilted, subtle and quiet. "A real cash purchase," Blake said loudly, his voice tinged with cruelty. "This isn't a flea market, ma'am. We're talking about $1 million vehicles. And people who buy them?" He looked her over again. "They don't dress like that." The heat rose to Maggie's cheeks, not from shame, but from a deep, righteous anger. She wasn't just thinking about herself. She was thinking of every person who'd ever been dismissed because they didn't fit someone else's definition of wealth. "I believe my money is just as valid as anyone else's," she said softly. Blake took a step closer, using his height like a weapon. "Look, you're wasting my time," he hissed. "Either make an appointment, with proper attire and proof of funds, or please, leave the gallery." The room fell into a suffocating silence. Mrs. Harrington slowly stepped out of the car. Her husband cleared his throat. They too looked uneasy. Then another voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" All heads turned. Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, had been drawn by the growing commotion. Blake straightened his tie, recovering his posture like a schoolboy caught mid-lie. "No problem, sir," he said quickly. "Just explaining our appointment policy to this woman. We reserve high-value showings for serious buyers." Richard's eyes scanned the room, then landed on Maggie. He paused. "Miss Collins," he said slowly, recognition dawning. "Margaret Collins?" Maggie nodded once. A hush swept the room. Blake's face paled. Miss Collins, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding, Richard said. Our clientele usually understands the exclusivity of these vehicles. Maggie smiled politely, though her heart still burned. Your sales manager made those policies quite clear. Blake, now flustered but still arrogant, doubled down. If you'd really cared, you could have called ahead, brought a statement, worn something fitting. These cars, he gestured to the collection like a curator in a private museum, are for a certain class of people. The crowd murmured. Some whispered. Others chuckled uncomfortably. Maggie looked around and saw the judgment in their eyes, the smugness in Blake's, and worst of all, the silent approval in the way Richard didn't interrupt him. She had faced discrimination before, but never this brazen, never this public. Her voice stayed calm, her dignity intact, but her spirit, it was wounded. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, Blake muttered loud enough for the room to hear. Some people really don't know their place. Outside, bathed in the morning light, Maggie stepped onto the sidewalk and pulled out her phone. Her hands trembled slightly, not from weakness but resolve. A small smile flickered across her face as she dialed. She was done playing small. Miles away, nestled on 5 quiet acres just outside Boston, the Collins estate sat with a grace that disguised the vast fortune behind it. The manicured lawns, the quiet stillness, the kind of elegance that didn't need to shout. Inside, in a home office lined with awards and framed patents, Alexander Collins looked up from his desk. He was 41, a pioneer in clean energy storage, a man who had quietly changed the world, and stayed grounded doing it. As Maggie entered, he immediately stood and moved to meet her. 15 years of marriage had made him an expert in reading her expressions. What happened? He asked, concern rising. Maggie sank into the leather chair across from him, her body still but her emotions spiraling. This morning, she said with a tight smile, was illuminating. She didn't need to explain yet. The storm she was about to unleash would do the talking for her. As Maggie recounted the events of the morning, every detail of the dealership's humiliation and Blake's condescension came back with startling clarity. Her voice remained calm, but Alexander could see the shadows behind her eyes. When she finished, he sat silently, the corners of his mouth tightening, his jaw set not with rage, but with something deeper, controlled, purposeful. But this wasn't about me, Maggie concluded quietly. I had the privilege to walk away knowing the truth, but how many others, people who could actually afford it, are turned away simply because they don't look the part? Alexander nodded slowly. In all their years together, it was Maggie's empathy for others, especially in moments she herself was wronged, that always moved him most. So what do you want to do? He asked. For a moment, she admitted, I wanted to do nothing, just buy Caroline's gift elsewhere and move on. She paused. But then I thought of Daniel, that young man who treated me with dignity, and I thought of everyone who doesn't get that, who leaves ashamed, when they should have been respected. She looked directly at him now. I don't want revenge. I want perspective. Alexander leaned back, a gleam forming in his eyes. I think I may have just the plan to give them both. Nothing too dramatic, Maggie warned with a wry smile. This isn't about getting someone fired. No cliches, Alexander chuckled. Just a little education. That evening, in the quiet of their home, they crafted a plan. Not to punish, but to reveal. Not to destroy, but to enlighten. Because real change, Maggie believed, didn't come from humiliation. It came from transformation. I won't be there, she said softly as they finalized the details. This isn't about me watching someone get what they deserve. It's about them learning to see differently. Then, with a twinkle in her eye, but I do expect a full report. The next morning arrived crisp and clear, one of those Boston days where the sky feels cleaner than usual. Inside Boston Luxury Motors, Blake Thompson strode into the showroom with his usual self-assurance, adjusting his signature blue tie. The incident from yesterday? Just another laugh over drinks, another delusional customer who thought luxury was for everyone. As the gallery lights shimmered over polished Bentleys and Astons, Blake wrapped up his morning meeting. "Remember," he said to the team, "we cater to a specific clientele. It's not elitism, it's efficiency." Daniel stood silently in the corner, his hands clenched behind his back. He wanted to speak up, but the words never quite found a way out. At exactly 10:17 a.m., a deep, thunderous purr of an engine rolled through the street, drawing heads toward the floor-to-ceiling glass. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even Blake's eyes narrowed. A Rolls-Royce Phantom, but not just any Phantom. This one had an extended wheelbase and a custom midnight blue finish that seemed to change shades as the sunlight touched it. Conservative estimates put it north of $1,200,000, 0 cents. Even Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, emerged from his office, drawn to the sudden reverence in the room. The car didn't just arrive, it commanded. The driver stepped out in full uniform, white gloves pristine, and walked with ceremonial grace to open the rear door. From the back seat emerged a man with an unmistakable aura. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence spoke for him. Alexander Collins, perfectly tailored charcoal suit, salt and pepper hair, posture that radiated quiet authority. Blake's instincts kicked into high gear. This wasn't just a sale, this was an opportunity, a high-level executive, maybe a celebrity, definitely someone important. "Good morning, sir," Blake called, cutting in before anyone else could approach. "Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors." He stepped directly into the man's path, offering his hand. "Blake Thompson, sales manager. Absolute honor to have you here." Alexander looked at Blake. His smile was polite, but it didn't reach his eyes. He shook Blake's hand firmly. "Alexander Collins," he said. The name rattled through Blake's brain like a loose bolt in a machine. It sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. Not yet. Still, that suit, that car, that presence. This was a client worth catering to. And what Blake didn't know was that this man had come not to shop. He had come to teach. "That's quite the machine," Blake said, nodding with exaggerated reverence toward the Phantom. "We're honored to have you, Mr. Collins. What brings you to our humble dealership today? Perhaps I can show you our newest arrivals. Just got in a limited edition." Alexander raised a hand gently, silencing him. "Actually, I'm here for a very specific car. The Azure Coupe. The deep black mule model." Blake's eyes lit up. Finally, he was back in control. "Excellent choice, sir. One of only 15 produced this year. I'd be happy to—" "I know where it is," Alexander cut in smoothly. "My wife was here yesterday. She expressed interest in it." Blake's grin held steady, but confusion flickered in his eyes. "Your wife?" "I don't recall. Perhaps one of my colleagues assisted her?" Alexander's face cooled instantly. "No, Mr. Thompson, you did, or more accurately, you refused to." A hush dropped over the room. "She was wearing jeans. A white t-shirt," Alexander continued. "You told her she might be more comfortable browsing your used inventory." Color drained from Blake's face. Behind him, Daniel, who had been quietly observing, gasped audibly. "Excuse me, I mean, Collins, Blake stammered, his usual sales patter vanishing like smoke. "There must be some misunderstanding. We welcome all clients." Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, had appeared beside them, drawn by the rising tension. "Is everything all right here?" Alexander turned to face him. "Mr. Mason, I presume." Yes," Richard said quickly, trying to regain composure. "Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors." "Thank you," Alexander said calmly. "I was just informing Mr. Thompson that my wife visited your showroom yesterday with the intent to purchase the Azure Coupe for her sister's birthday." Richard's smile faltered. I do recall a brief exchange, but I wasn't aware of the full context." Alexander's voice remained composed. The context is this. Your sales manager decided that my wife, Margaret Collins, didn't belong here, because of how she looked, because of her clothes. A small crowd had gathered now. Salespeople, staff, even a few early customers. The whole showroom had turned into a theater. Blake began to babble. If there was any offense, it was not intentional. Daniel stepped forward, surprising even himself. Mr. Collins, your wife was treated unfairly, he said clearly. She was respectful. She said exactly what she wanted, but Mr. Thompson kept shutting her down, over and over, because of how she dressed. Blake glared at him, but the damage had been done. Alexander turned to Richard Mason again. What's interesting is, my wife didn't come here as Mrs. Collins. She came as herself. Margaret, founder of the Collins Foundation for Children with Disabilities. The name dropped like a weight in the room. She's raised over $50 million to fund specialized schools, therapies, and adaptive medical equipment, Alexander said. She lives simply because she believes in connecting with the families she serves. That's one of the many reasons I fell in love with her. Richard looked pale. Mr. Collins, I assure you, this isn't who we are. This doesn't reflect our values. Alexander cut him off. Values are defined by action, Mr. Mason, not by mission statements painted on the walls. He turned toward Blake, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the polished floor. I didn't come here to buy just one car, Alexander continued. Yes, I intended to purchase the Azure for my sister-in-law, but I was also evaluating where to replace our company's entire executive fleet. 7 vehicles in total, and my personal collection as well. Richard's breath caught. That kind of sale could fulfill their quarterly numbers in one transaction? But now, Alexander said, I'm wondering if this is the kind of place I want representing that investment. The room fell into stunned silence. Blake looked physically ill. Richard stumbled over his words, desperate. Please, let us make this right. We'll do anything. You have my word. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps there's a path forward, he said, but it'll take more than selling me a car. Of course, Richard said quickly, whatever it takes. The Collins Foundation is hosting a charity gala next month, Alexander said. We're raising funds for a new adaptive sports complex for children with physical disabilities. He turned to Blake with a calm steel in his voice. I believe your presence could be educational. Blake blinked. Sir? Not as a guest, Alexander clarified, as a volunteer. The words landed like thunder. Coordinating parking, serving tables, cleaning up afterward. I think it would be a valuable experience to work side by side with the people you once believed didn't belong. The staff exchanged looks. Daniel smiled subtly. Richard, speechless, could only nod. Blake swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Alexander nodded. Then we'll be in touch. And with that he turned, walked back to the Phantom and was driven away, leaving behind a showroom forever changed. Inside, Daniel walked over to the Azure coupe. He gently reached for the keys, paused, and looked out the window. A lesson had just been delivered, not through anger, but through dignity. And sometimes, that's the sharpest truth of all. Alexander's message was subtle, but its weight was unmistakable. The Foundation is always looking for volunteers, he said to Richard Mason, especially those willing to assist with event setup. It helps people truly understand the work when they see it with their own eyes. He didn't need to say more. This wasn't just about a car. It was about human values, about confronting the quiet bias that often slips beneath the surface. Alexander then turned back to the dealership owner. Mr. Mason, it might be wise to consider unconscious bias training for your staff. I know several excellent consultants who could help. Richard nodded, the gravity of the morning settling into his chest. We'd welcome that initiative, Mr. Collins, absolutely. With the conversation shifting, Alexander looked to Daniel, the young salesman who had spoken up with honesty when it mattered. I'd like you, Alexander said clearly, to handle the paperwork for the Azure, for my sister-in-law. Daniel's eyes widened. Thank you, sir. I'd be honored. "I know you will," Alexander replied with conviction. Then he added, "And now, let's discuss the corporate vehicle fleet." As they walked toward Mason's office, Alexander paused beside the azure coupe, his hand gliding along its smooth, gleaming surface. "My wife has excellent taste, doesn't she?" Blake stood off to the side, motionless. The polished world he'd once controlled with confidence had fractured, and in its reflection the truth stared back. A man's character isn't revealed in how he treats those he needs, but in how he treats those he thinks he doesn't. 1 month later, the grand ballroom of the Bostonian Hotel echoed with laughter and live music. The Collins Foundation Gala had become a vibrant celebration of children with disabilities and their families. Doctors, therapists, and donors mingled, celebrating progress and possibility. Near the entrance, a familiar figure was hard at work, not in a suit, but in a concierge's vest. Blake Thompson stood beside a boy in a wheelchair, adjusting microphone cables for the evening's performance. This wasn't the Blake who had once measured worth by watches and shoes. Something had shifted. What began as punishment had become transformation. Through days of volunteering, guiding, lifting, learning, he'd witnessed resilience in children who faced battles he never imagined. And in their courage, he saw his own privilege exposed. Across the room, Maggie Collins, in a soft blue dress, approached him. She smiled gently. "How's the night treating you, Mr. Thompson?" Blake paused. "Honestly? He's teaching me about adaptive basketball," he said, nodding toward the boy beside him. "And I'm getting thoroughly destroyed." Maggie laughed warmly. "Well, sounds like you have an honest coach." His face turned serious. "Mrs. Collins, I know I already apologized in the showroom, but I want to say it again. This time, not as an employee, but as a man. I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. There's no excuse." "There wasn't," she agreed softly. "But I didn't sense hatred in you. Just habits." She let the silence settle, then added, "The real lesson is this: respect should be the default until someone proves they don't deserve it, not the other way around." Blake nodded, humbled. It was a hard lesson, but a good one. They stood in quiet understanding. Then, from across the room, Alexander approached, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. "She's always been the teacher in this family," he said with a proud smile. Then to Blake, "I hear you've become quite the advocate for the adaptive sports program." Blake nodded. "Yes, sir. I've signed up to continue volunteering even after the mandatory time, and I've been working with Mr. Mason to redesign how we approach clients. No more assumptions based on appearance." Alexander's expression softened. "That's good to hear." Then he surprised everyone. "Do you remember that corporate fleet I mentioned? Turns out we're still in the market," he said, pausing. "Maybe you'd like to handle that order." Blake's jaw dropped. "Sir, I would be honored, truly." Daniel, standing nearby, beamed. He knew what that moment meant. As the evening drew to a close, Blake watched Maggie and Alexander move gracefully through the crowd, greeting guests, embracing families, laughing with children. They never flaunted their wealth. They never needed to. Their power came not from their money, but from the quiet way they restored dignity to others. And in that ballroom, filled with stories of struggle and triumph, one more transformation had taken root. Blake Thompson had once judged people by what they wore. Now he was learning to see who they really were.